Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting.
Oh.
Well, not the ones you're hoping for.
Okay. Thank you?
You want squeals of delight.
Yes!
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
To get those, make everyone on your list feel heard with gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, vintage pieces, and home decor. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen won an incident and penalty-packed Qatar Grand Prix despite Red Bull being off the pace at the start of the weekend. So how did they turn it around, and why did this become a Grand Prix that will be remembered more for the race control and stewarding calls than the battling on track? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Scott Mitchell-Malm, Mark Hughes and Samarth Kanal. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. Huge news during the Qatar Grand Prix weekend. Nothing to do with on or off track action in Doha, but the Race F1 podcast is going live again with a show in London on January the 16th next year and in Birmingham on January the 17th. Excited? What have you got planned?
I am very excited. I really enjoyed it when we did the first live show in London. Kind of fun to be going on a almost like mini tour in the off season, just to keep us busy. So I think it'll be a fun opportunity to, talk about, look ahead to 2025, but also maybe have a little bit more kind of audience engagement, go into a few things in a bit more detail, go a bit behind the scenes. I'm sure we'll have some fun putting together the running order for that show. Absolutely, no doubt. The question is, Ed, I know that you are incredibly confident about your podcasting game, but are you ready to take it on tour? That's the big question.
I think so. And we're easing our way in. We're not playing on a wet Tuesday night in Stoke in winter. So it's Birmingham and London. So easing our way in with some of the metropolitan centres. So I'm not too worried. How about you, Mark Hughes? You weren't in our first live show that we did. When was that? Last year now. But you are signed up this time.
Yeah, I've been promised a tour bus and all the equipments. And so I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to it a lot. And... being on tour like a band, it sounds great. What we're going to do, we got after shows and stuff like that?
Who knows? Well, the first thing they need to do is work out what budget they've got left after we've A, laid on the extravaganza we're going to have, and B, paid for the various items on your rider, which I won't reveal to listeners, but it's extensive and expensive. So, we'll see what's left. And Samarth, not in the lineup for the live show, but I'm sure if you bought a ticket, you'll be welcome to come along. So, have you bought your ticket yet?
Well, let's see. Let's see how he does in maybe this podcast, and next week in Abu Dhabi can be a little bit of his an attempt for him to audition for some kind of live show cameo if he really excels?
I'm fine. I'll buy a ticket, Scott. Don't worry about that. I don't do well under pressure anyway. So I'd rather see how you do it. And, I don't want to, all the budget's gone on Mark's rider now. So I don't want to ruin that. You're welcome, Mark.
I like the idea that Samarth has just spent the last few days with me and Mark here in Qatar and decided this was so much fun doing it for free. I'm willing to pay for it. Next time, I'm willing to pay for a ticket to hear from them for a few hours in either Birmingham or London.
Well, I must admit, I charge Samarth for every conversation I have with him, and he gets terrible value for money out of it, I must admit. But if you'd like to join Samarth in buying tickets, you can click the link in the episode description or head to podlifeevents.com and you can search for the Race F1 podcast to purchase your tickets. As I said, it's London on Thursday, January the 16th in Conway Hall, and then in Birmingham on January the 17th. That's a Friday in the Old Rep Theatre, and we will see you there. Let's get back more onto Qatar Grand Prix business now. Mark, lots of incidents and controversy to talk about related to this race. Perhaps not quite so much racing, one of those ones, but obviously Max Verstappen rose above everything. How did he go from having what he described as a rally car and finishing 8th in the sprint to taking pole position, even if he didn't start there, and then winning the race?
Yeah, it all happened Saturday in between the sprint, or the rally sprint as it might have been called for him, and qualifying for the Grand Prix. And of course, you're allowed to change setup this year. And so they did. They'd arrived here expecting it to be more like last year, even though it's a few weeks later, in terms of the weather and the temperature and the track grip. But what they found was very different, of course. And the changes they made weren't radical, but they were very effective. They were just to do with ride heights and suspension and damping. And they weren't, they didn't change the aero at all. But it just made the car drivable in the low speed or the lower speed stuff, and still retained its speed in the fast final sector, where it had always been quick, even when it was struggling in the other bit. So yeah, it was balanced enough that with Max Verstappen behind the wheel, it set the fastest qualifying time, although didn't start from pole, as we know. And then, he emerged out of the turn 1-2 sequence in the lead, and then that was it.
Yeah, very much so. Lando Norris did have a go at the second safety car restart. He had a little bit of an attack, but couldn't quite make it stick. And then, of course, things went wrong for him in the race. And, of course, the key moment, I guess, for Verstappen was jumping Russell at the start. Some interesting comments from Max Verstappen after the race about George Russell, though, wasn't there, Scott? What did you make of those? He was quite angry about Russell's involvement in the penalty. We'll probably get into the detail of the penalty later, but quite interesting to see there was a bit of needle there.
Yeah, there was. Verstappen clearly very unhappy with how Russell conducted himself in the stewards room. This was more than just a little bit of banter, sort of out of view, or we saw them chatting, didn't we, after qualifying, before they went into the press conference. And you always see little moments where drivers interact with each other, but this was very much behind closed doors. And what it sounds like from what Max said and a couple of other stories that I've heard, Max was very unhappy in the moment, and he feels that Russell went out of his way basically to get him punished above and beyond, I guess, because I think all drivers accept that if there is a certain conviction of wrongdoing, then their rivals are going to push for that, aren't they? Whether that's in the public, whether that's over the radio.
When you say a certain conviction, do you mean the slightest chance of getting an opponent penalised?
Yes.
That seems to be the bar for most of them.
Yeah, but I do think when it comes to when something then goes to the stewards room, I feel like we've had quite a few cases where drivers who are a little bit more forthright with their opinion to us immediately after a session soften a little bit by the time they get to the stewards room, unless they're absolute, unless it's something more egregious. And this was clearly something that Verstappen thought would be let go, and Russell had no intention of letting it go. So Verstappen, by all accounts, was incensed by it, and then he made that very much known after the race. But I don't think you needed to wait for his comments after the race to know how frustrated and angry he was. You only had to see how he lined his car up on the grid for the start. There was no doubt in my mind that if Max Verstappen got a decent launch, he would lead into turn one. Whether he'd lead coming out of it, I think would depend on exactly the trajectories of the cars going into the corner and through it. But Max was very, very, very much gunning for Russell turn one. So much so that he actually left the door open for Lando, didn't he, a little bit, but then he covered Lando back off expertly. It was just one of those situations where I could see the body language of the car and the way Max was going about it. He was gonna right the wrong his own way, wasn't he?
Yeah, that was very, very much on his mind. And you're right, it seems to be the fact that Russell was stronger, apparently behind closed doors, than perhaps he was publicly. But it doesn't really surprise me. You know, these are a ruthless lot, particularly the front-running Grand Prix drivers. George Russell fancies himself as a future world champion, and he's a seriously good driver. So it doesn't entirely surprise me to see him trying to push for that sort of thing. But I think also the feeling that the way he drove on that lap, because it was they were both on not on flying laps at the time. I think probably there was a little bit of unhappiness with the fact that he was almost trying to sucker Verstappen into a penalty. But we'll see what they say about that in Abu Dhabi at the weekend. But Scott, it was Lando Norris who was set to finish second. He had that 10-second stop-go penalty for not respecting yellow flags, recovered to 10th and fastest lap. Costly error though, wasn't it? Fair penalty, do you think?
Was very costly. The answer to whether it's fair is, I think, yes and no. It's fair in that is what the penalty is. You can't complain about an offence that basically carries a prescribed penalty, which I think it does in this case, even though we've not seen it applied, because it's actually very rare for drivers to get caught out by not slowing under double-waved yellows. But if they do fail to slow under double-waved yellows in the race, it is a 10-second stop-go penalty. So in that sense, it's fair. They didn't just pull the penalty out of nowhere. They didn't make something up on the fly. And Lando knew he was banged to rights. So in that sense, as soon as I saw that he was under investigation for it, I thought if he's guilty, that's a very serious penalty coming. Can't really have any complaints about it. The bit about it being unfair, I suppose, is when you then argue, okay, does the punishment fit the crime? Which is sort of what McLaren was arguing afterwards. That is a valid point to make in itself, but it's a separate one. You can't adjust the rules in the moment. You can only reflect on them afterwards. And if the conclusion to this is that this is a situation where stewards need to be able to apply discretion because you need to be able to judge the severity of the offence and then match the punishment to that rather than have a blanket punishment for double-waved yellows. It's a separate debate entirely. I actually don't mind a zero-tolerance policy and clamp down on double-waved yellows. We've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about penalising drivers too much and not liking penalties, but double-waved yellows for me and drivers ignoring yellow flags, I think is one of the biggest endemic problems in motorsport. And it comes from the top in Formula One because you don't see them respecting the yellows. You know, double-waved yellows, it relates to a hazard on the track, something partly or wholly blocking the track, be prepared to stop, slow down significantly, all of that. And drivers never do that. So you could argue that actually we should probably see more penalties like this so that drivers get the message, but we don't. The other aspect to this is, should the double-waved yellows even have been out, given it was a bit of debris on track, and if it was that severe and needed to be taken seriously, why wasn't a safety car or VSC thrown sooner? Blah blah blah. So there are a lot of layers to it, I think.
Yeah, I must admit, given it was Alex Albon's mirror that was on the track, quite a substantial piece of debris, it would have made a lot of sense to throw some kind of safety car. I will throw in a kind of combined question from the Race Members Club at this stage, because Mike Mason, Andy Sally and David Sayer all asked about it. They wanted to know the reasons for for the delay in throwing a safety car when Albon's mirror was on the track, and Robert Charlton mentions that the F1 TV commentator suggested that it was allowed to stay on the track without the safety car because the race director didn't want to intervene approaching the pit window, and if such things are taken into account. Mark, I'll throw that question at you. There are actually reasons why it's a little bit difficult to be definitive in the answer on that, because the FIA say they're going to give us a proper explanation, but have rather dragged their heels, and we're probably going to have to wait until tomorrow to get a clear one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame that, because obviously they're going to get a lot of criticism in the meantime, and which they could maybe have headed off with a fuller explanation, but there you go. I would suspect that the reason they say they wouldn't throw a VSC is because there wouldn't have been a safe gap in the traffic for the work for the whoever it was going to retrieve it, and that the the theory on F1 TV may well be true that they felt a safety car would be a little bit too severe for the moment, and it might have had an undue influence on the outcome of the race. But if it's a safety related issue, I think if it has an impact on the outcome of the race, that's just how it should roll. That is part of the game, just the randomness of luck sometimes. It's difficult to, as you say, to be definitive, because it's difficult to argue the case when you don't know what case is going to be presented. But I think it would have probably warranted a safety car. It should probably have warranted a safety car straight away.
Well, we were talking about this during the race, weren't we, Scott, before Bottas piled into it, because I just didn't understand where it was going to go. How were they going to leave it there for the rest of the race? Because it was just waiting for someone to hit it and scatter debris everywhere.
Yeah. There's 30 laps to go or something like that. If effectively it was neutralised on the only overtaken spot of the entire circuit. So are we going to run the rest of the race with no possibility of overtaking there?
That's the thing. There was one or two people I heard after the race saying that they didn't have a problem with it being left there. It didn't seem to be too problematic. One team boss even said that, you couldn't have expected Bottas to pull aside and let a car by at that point of the track. Well, one, it's a start-finish straight. It's the straight, and it's just off the main racing line. So, yes, there's actually every chance that a car's going to move one car width offline, especially as that's the only overtaking spot on the circuit. So what happens if you have wheel-to-wheel racing and it's not dealt with under yellow flags, for example, and it just lies there? As far as I can tell, there is absolutely no excuse for it. It's a clear piece of debris that can very easily turn into many smaller pieces. And whether or not it led to the punctures that we saw is neither here nor there, because it was just an unnecessary safety issue. And it is annoying and frustrating that we don't have that FIA explanation. And I don't think there's any good reason not to have had. It took them, I think, a couple of hours to inform us that the explanation we were going to get, we weren't actually probably going to get until the morning now. If there's a clear reason and rationale for it, I don't understand why it would take this long to put it together. So that concerns me a little bit in terms of what we're actually going to get. My fear is that whether we got it tonight or get it in the morning, it's just going to be a quite convoluted justification of everything that happened. Partly because I think that is how some people in those positions risk defaulting to sometimes. But I fear that the FIA is currently closing ranks for its president around anybody associated with any of the changes that he's directly or indirectly forced in recent weeks. And I don't think the FIA is going to come out and do anything that they believe is in any way throwing race control under the bus after they've effectively just justified the president's interventions and changes by saying that, in essence, they've made the race director's job loads easier because there's loads of people doing it now and helping and everything. So everything's covered and there shouldn't be any problems. So why does something like that happen in the Grand Prix?
Yeah, it's a good question. And who knows, maybe there is some brilliant explanation. But I must admit, when there is a certain amount of heel dragging on explanation, normally it's done in the hope that some of the scrutiny will go away, I think, that people will have moved on. And rather than just grabbing the bull by the horns, it's being delayed and deferred, which I think is a real shame. So all I can do is look at it and say, it just didn't look like good management of the race. I don't know what was going to happen because that mirror was not going to remove itself on its own. Nobody could go into the track to remove it while the track was live. You need a safety car for that. So what was going to happen? Either it would sit there for the rest of the race and people couldn't drive on that bit of track for a substantial number of laps, or somebody would hit it, and somebody did hit it after only a few laps. So yeah, I really don't get it. I'm normally happy to hear out race control on these things because generally they do make good decisions, often even if we can't entirely see why at the time. But until an explanation is forthcoming, very, very difficult to say that. What we don't know is for sure, or what wasn't immediately clear in the race, and I don't know, Samarth, whether you can shed some light on this, because we're just about to talk about Ferrari, but was Carlos Sainz's puncture down to the debris, and Was Lewis Hamilton's puncture down to the debris? Because it was both front left, wasn't it, that went, which is the very, very stressed tyre. So it's possible it could have been coincidence. What do they know?
Well, they suspect it is, and the implication was that they quite, and by they I mean Pirelli, they kind of quite strongly suspect it is, but until they bring the tyres back and then look at them, they can't make that judgment call yet, which is completely fair. You don't want to jump to conclusions, but yeah, I spoke to Mario Isla after the race, and he said we pretty much suspected it, and the tyres were quite worn there, so the tread was quite, it was quite thin. It was easily penetrated by all that debris, and I think both of them did pick it up. I think because tyre wear wasn't as bad at this track as in last year as well, so it wasn't like a catastrophic failure, I think anyway. However, on the replays, I didn't see any debris go in. I didn't see, so it could have been a tiny shard of carbon fiber. The thing is, when carbon fiber breaks, it is incredibly sharp. It's incredibly, it can really go through stuff like that, like a tire carcass. So yeah, we'll find out soon, I'm sure, but I strongly suspect it is.
Yeah, it came at a really unfortunate time. It came towards the end of the tire life, when the mirror came off, and this is a circuit, and it happened here last year, where there isn't really any performance degradation of the tyres. They just get worn out, and when the tread finally wears away, then that's when you have to get rid of them. But until then, they perform very well. So everybody, and also the medium, which nearly everyone started on, was a much faster tyre than the hard. So everybody obviously wanted go as long as possible on the medium, and so there were most people still hadn't stopped, and most people were very reluctant to stop afterwards because there might have been a safety car, in which case you could get a cheap pit stop. So yeah, it came at the worst possible time.
And just to throw in the additional detail, I checked the onboards. Hamilton's failure certainly was detected by him pretty much in the debris field. Sainz's failure, however, he only picked up at the last corner. So that the Hamilton one, there's a little bit more of alignment on time. The Sainz one less so, but you can pick up the debris and work its way through. I don't know. So it's very hard to draw conclusions from that, and it will take Pirelli a couple of days to they normally collect up all the bits of the tyre that they can, not just what gets back to the pits, but what they can pick up and put it in a big bag, and then they'll study it in Milan, I imagine, and come up with an answer in a few days. Well, let's come back to Ferrari performance-wise, Samarth. They weren't optimistic coming into Qatar. Despite Sainz getting that puncture, they actually managed to close the Constructors' Championship gap to McLaren. Did they see it as a bullet dodged, given for a big chunk of the race, the Constructors wasn't quite done and dusted for McLaren, but they were basically in the territory of needing a few points in Abu Dhabi, regardless of what Ferrari did. So a bit frustrating for McLaren, but Ferrari must have been happy.
Absolutely. I mean, well, it's one hell of a result. Sainz was desperately unlucky there with the tyre as well. Just going back to that, I think it could have been a lot better of a result for him had he not had to drive round the track again with a puncture. That slowed him down massively. But I think in the context of this weekend, I think it's a pretty great result in terms of that. I don't think it's the best result ever. I think Ferrari definitely would be hoping for more. But, that it's going down to the wire in Abu Dhabi is pretty all right, because I thought McLaren would have had this wrapped up here, to be quite honest. I almost feel like if we look the other way, I feel like this is a massive opportunity lost for McLaren and almost a lifeline for Ferrari in a sense. I'm not saying that I'm confident that they'll seal the deal in Abu Dhabi. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that this is a lifeline because it is going down to Abu Dhabi. So yeah, I think it's probably as good as I expected for them.
Yeah, they gained 3 points on McLaren on a weekend where everyone expected them to lose ground, and they were going to lose ground substantially. What is it? It's 640 plays 619, so 21 points the gap. Handy lead for McLaren. Red Bull, of course, now completely out of the Constructors' Championship, but they've not been a factor for some time. Your time and expertise are valuable, and with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. And best of all, Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites, allowing you to work smarter, not longer. For 15 years, Grammarly has helped professionals do more with their writing. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Thursday Night Football is on, and it's only on Prime Video.
Breaks free for the touchdown.
This week, it's an NFC North showdown as the Green Bay Packers face the Detroit Lions.
Unbelievable catch.
Coverage begins at 7 p.m. Eastern with TNF Tonight, presented by Verizon. Not a Prime member? Sign up for a 30-day free trial to stream the game. It's the Packers and the Lions, Thursday at 7, only on Prime Video. Restrictions apply. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details.
Right, we'll get back into the Qatar Grand Prix in a moment, but first, a shout out to our episode sponsors, the Formula One Heineken Dutch Grand Prix. It's without doubt one of the highlights of the F1 calendar, an amazing race at a fantastic track. Nothing quite like it, is there, Scott?
It's a unique experience, just simply by arriving. I think it's the only race of the season that I get the train into the circuit and then walk along the seafront. Heading up to the track. I love it as a blast from the past that has been modernised to offer what current Formula One events offer around the world, but in this utterly unique location. And when you look at some of the circuits and races that have joined the calendar, and not just in the last few years, but over the last decade or so, I love that Zandvoort to me is just a great example of what kind of track and race and event is possible in modern F1. It doesn't have to fit a certain type of mould, does it? Because I would say the Dutch Grand Prix definitely doesn't fit the normal mould.
Yeah, it's unique. The thing that you might not realise if you've not been to Zandvoort is that obviously it's right on the coast, it's by the beach, the sand dunes and everything, everyone knows that. But it's really close to Amsterdam. Not far at all from the centre of town. You can cycle, you can get the train, you can combine the race weekend with a visit to what's a really beautiful city. It's about 30 minutes from Schiphol Airport, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's very well connected. So I think it's a good race to go to for obviously for anyone within Europe, but even from further afield, to be honest. And it's basically a city break with a Grand Prix attached to it, or vice versa, however you want to look at it, the Dutch Grand Prix. So it's a great combination. And yeah, there are very, very, very few races that offer the option of travelling in by train and then having a nice walk. And there are none that do that along the seafront. It is a good experience.
Exactly. City break, beach holiday, Grand Prix. It's got everything, hasn't it? I'm delighted it returned to the calendar a few years ago. There's no better place to see the greatest cars and drivers competing. It's a challenging, old-school track.
Off-track entertainment as well. Not that we can particularly partake in it, but the 4-day rave that the fans turn it into there kind of give us a little bit of a glimpse of the raucous atmosphere that you can find with the musical acts that perform there too.
Absolutely, everyone seems to be having a lovely time, and you've got the really loud and lively places, and there's a few more relaxed and chilled out cafes around and that kind of thing. So something for everyone. So register your interest in attending the 2025 Dutch Grand Prix now by clicking the link in the description. Well, let's get back to Qatar now, Mark. Russell picked up pole position after Verstappen's grid penalty. It was clear the Mercedes was quick. Was this a big opportunity missed for him, given he ultimately finished fourth? And why was he so much stronger than Lewis Hamilton?
It wasn't an opportunity missed. The car was eating through its tyres. It was about the only car on the field that was suffering thermal degradation. I talked before about how that wasn't the mechanism. It was still the mechanism on the Mercedes, and I think it's probably that car puts more energy through its front tyres than any other, and that was enough to trigger the thermal deg. It was probably also the reason why it was so good in Vegas, because there you needed to get the tyres up to temperature, and most cars were struggling to do that. So what was a strength in Vegas really hurt them. Here, the car was quick over a lap, but in the sprint format, you don't really get a chance to do much long running, and it was only discovered probably about 15 laps into the race that there's no way those tyres were going to hang on. And Hamilton was similarly afflicted in the race, even before his puncture. They had the same limitation in the car, front end, just the car won't turn. And why was he slower in qualifying? It's the continuing theme of this year. He just has no confidence in the car when it's not in its sweet spot, and that sort of triggers a sort of a vicious circle, if you like, whereby you don't get the tires working properly, and the balance is off, which means you don't get the tires are still, not balanced between the two axles, and he was never happy or anything other than mystified as to why he was unable to extract performance from the car when he had done as recently as Vegas on race day a week earlier.
And of course his struggles meant that it was possible for Leclerc to come through to second, along with Norris's penalty. Leclerc pretty much got the maximum out of the Ferrari. Another strong weekend from him, and Piastri picked up third place with Russell, fourth, which disappointed. But as you've explained, that was about all he could do. And Lewis Hamilton looks like he can't wait for the end of his Mercedes career in the end of the season, which, Scott, brings us on to Alpine. Now, the small headline, I guess, for them is that Pierre Gasly had an excellent fifth place, back up to sixth in the Constructors' Championship. But Esteban Ocon, it sounds like he's someone who's not going to have to wait for the end of his Alpine career in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, I was about to say that he's competed in his last Grand Prix for Alpine, but I will rephrase that to he has taken his last start for Alpine, because I don't think it's fair to say he competed in the Qatar Grand Prix. It lasted a few seconds. And it was, in the grand scheme of things, a fitting way for this season to end, given how disappointing it's been of late. But yeah, I suspect by the time some people listen to this, it may well be official. But Ocon is out at Alpine. He will be replaced by Jack Doohan in Abu Dhabi for the season finale. It's tricky, because the bottom line is that Ocon has had to accept this to be able to break ties from Alpine early and get in with Haas. He'll take part in the Abu Dhabi postseason test for Haas, which was something that Haas was told was on several races ago now. But I think because ultimately Ocon is still under contract with Alpine until the end of December, Alpine knows that offer could have been rescinded. So there was effectively an ultimatum. If you want out out to drive in the test, we want you out for the final race to put Doohan in. So there are multiple reasons for this. One is that Ocon is not contributing anything in the Constructors' battle anyway. He's been struggling, he's been low on pace, he's been indirectly bad-mouthing the team by effectively accusing them of not being able to supply two cars of the same calibre. Even though he's not quite said it in such terms, he just keeps hinting at it in that annoying, like in the same way that Hamilton does it, in that like annoyingly hinty, slightly paranoid way that suggests they're being screwed over in some way, but they don't really want to commit to saying that, and so they're kind of leaving you to connect some dots, but the dots aren't fully there, and it's all just a little bit cryptic and pointless. So there's nothing really to be gained by keeping him if he performs like this. He's unhappy and he wants out, so it's mutually beneficial in a way, and they get a chance to bring Doohan in and evaluate him. So it's sad that it ends this way. He's had a good affiliation with Alpine. He became a Grand Prix winner with the team, scored a few other podiums as well, including Brazil, obviously. So he's played a crucial role this season in them having that chance and having control of that fight for 6th in the championship. But the way it's gone over the last 2 weekends in particular with some of the comments, I think a clean break is better for everybody. And I think Ocon's right not to fight that kind of desire to get him out the car for Abu Dhabi too hard. He is better off focusing on the future, I think, and getting ready for Haas. And I wouldn't be surprised if Ocon is in Abu Dhabi and is basically with Haas over the weekend. My suspicion, understanding, is that to have accepted this, I don't think it would just be for the test. I think this is a clean break straight away. So I think he might be a Haas driver sooner than we think.
Bit of a risk, though, for Alpine, isn't it? They're 5 points clear now in that battle for 6th. But as you say, although Ocon, other than that, second place in the wet in Brazil, hasn't contributed much recently, he's still more likely to bring you home some points than Jack Doohan. So it could weaken their lineup. I know it's not been going well, but Jack Doohan, with the best will in the world, being dropped in for his Grand Prix debut, yes, he knows the team, he'll have prepared for it, but you'd still back Ocon over him. So surely it's weakening their own hand, isn't it?
Yeah, you would, but look at what other drivers, young drivers, have done when stepping in. If Doohan's as good as Alpine need him to be and think he is, he'll be in that car's capable of scoring points. He should fight and score points. Ollie Behrman did it for Ferrari. Ollie Behrman did it for Haas. Franco Colapinto did it pretty immediately with Williams. These drivers, that's what they're expected to do now. That Liam Lawson did it last year. That is the bar that has been set now. And honestly, part of me wonders if that's why Alpine have done it as well, because we reported this a while ago. Ed, obviously, you're well aware of this. Alpine very briefly showed an interest in Franco Colapinto. Maybe more than just briefly. They looked into it. We also know that Alpine considered for a little while how early they could get Ocon out of the car. And the plan then would have been to put Doohan in. So, reading between the lines, was there a potential interest in seeing how good Doohan is, and if he's not quite good enough, binning him off before 2025 or early in 2025, however it would play out, and replace him with Colapinto? Because there was no reason for Alpine to be interested in Colapinto and speaking to them if they had full faith in Doohan, and the plan was to be Gasly and Doohan all year next year. That's obviously not quite played out because the championship battle meant that they really needed Gasly and Ocon in the car. And from what I've heard this weekend in Qatar, I feel like Alpine's interest in Colapinto has cooled a little bit, which is probably because of the crashes and the pace versus Albon in the last few. So I'd like to think Doohan's place is nice and secure, because it would be ridiculous to sign him and announce him and then cut his legs out from underneath him before even starting. But yeah, something doesn't feel quite right there with the interest that they've shown and the way that they've played it. And I hope that Doohan, that they allow him the chance to just treat this as race zero of 2025. I hope that this isn't anything more than that. And the reason I say that is because while I think there are some very sensible people at Alpine and Enstone, and I don't think Oliver Oakes would go that way as a team principal, I can't discount anything when Flavio Briatore is in charge, because he's ruthless and he will act in whatever way he feels is in the team's best interest.
Let's look elsewhere in the mid-pack now. Samarth, Aston Martin didn't have a great sprint, but Fernando Alonso was 7th in the Grand Prix. So how did he do that? And did Aston Martin make a genuine step?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting race for Aston Martin there. Firstly, Lance Stroll. I mean, he gets a lot of criticism, I think, but I don't think it was completely fair for him to get that penalty today. I think he just stepped out just a little bit with a bit of understeer, and the FIA reasoned that he'd gone over the curbs, which caused understeer. And I'm like, well, he's completely. That's not a quote, by the way. That I'm paraphrasing that quite badly because I don't have the document in front of me. But he's completely entitled to use the curbs. It's a racetrack. I think he didn't go off the track. So it was a bit unlucky.
Honest mistake territory.
Yeah, so it was a bit unlucky for him to go out of the race. They retired after taking the penalty because they didn't see any point, and they had a bit of damage, I'm sure. Now going to Alonso, great performance though. This shows just how good he is. I mean, 7th in that car, I believe, right? That is, for Aston Martin, that's a bit of a coup. They're in no man's land, of course. They're kind of in this weird destination where I still think they're a bit lost with developing the car. So I don't think it's that big a step. I'm not convinced that they've got on top of those issues. And it's funny, some teams have actually brought in parts for 2025 to kind of test them out, do some A/B testing, see if this is working, see if that's going to work for 2025. Alpine did it this weekend with a new front wing and nose. I haven't seen much from Aston Martin, and they're still, I believe, using the floor from Hungary. If that's correct, I think that's correct, Mark. I'm looking at him and he's nodding, yeah.
Yeah, it is. They were back to the Hungary floor for this one, haven't been on the earlier floor in the other races. The Hungary floors, it seems to work better on the higher speed circuits, ironically.
They've got a quick track floor and a slow track floor, but not one that they can mix and match for any compromise circuits.
Yeah, and it just feels like they haven't made that extra step in finding out really where they're going wrong. I'm not convinced they've understood it. So is this a step forward? No, I don't. I think it's more of a false dawn, and we're kind of, well, not a false dawn. It's more of just of a nice blip for them. A nice positive blip to end the season. Let's say. I'm not sure they'll do so well in Abu Dhabi either, but if stuff like this happens, we see debris on the track and people skating off at turn one and driving around with 3 tyres, then maybe Aston Martin can add some more points.
And elsewhere in the midfield, Mark, for the first time this season, a Sauber finished in the points. Zhou Guanyu earned those points with an excellent 8th place. How much of that was down to luck and how much of it was speed?
Oh, no, they're genuinely much quicker since the new floor. And they got both cars into Q2. And no, it was genuinely a pretty quick car. And Zhou Guanyu has responded to it, and it seems to be much more to his taste. He seems much more able to extract the most from it than he could with the old spec. And he's back to giving Valtteri Bottas a run for his money again, which he was doing the previous year.
Yeah, and a good reminder that Joe is a handy driver. I don't think he's a superstar in Formula One, but he's certainly a better driver than what he's looked like for most of this season when he's been rooted to the back, and he's had all sorts of problems, some publicised, some not so well talked about, that have held him back. So good for him. Scott, what do you reckon? Visit to our favourite place?
Yes, as happy as I am for Joe, and I told him so when I bumped into him in the paddock. Shook his hand, patted him on the back, and just said, "Really happy for you. I don't think we can avoid going here for the other Sauber driver."
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
So, frustrating race for Bottas. He was 10th, a few laps from home before Norris passed him. How much sympathy does he deserve for this one, Scott?
Quite a lot, I think, just because of almost every aspect of it. I mean, Bottas was 6th in free practice, which is always a little bit of a difficult one to judge on a sprint weekend. Everyone's doing things that are a little bit different. But then he was competitive in sprint qualifying as well, easily through into SQ2 in the top 10 in the first part of qualifying there. Not quite quick enough to be in the top 10 there, but still better, obviously, than it has been recently, and raced perfectly well just outside the top 10 in the sprint race. Then the race itself obviously was out-qualified by Joe, so behind him on the grid on merit, but very much in that mix. And with the way that the race played out, it could have been anyone in that midfield fight sort of sneaking into the top 10. And yeah, if it wasn't for Norris's late recovery, I mean, well, if Norris hadn't had the penalty, he wouldn't have been out at the top 10 anyway, and Bottas probably obviously wouldn't have been in, so ifs and buts. But he was right in the mix, and it was Sauber's most competitive weekend of the year, certainly since the start of the season. It was a race with enough quirk and circumstance to give them an opportunity, and just Bottas's luck of lucks, really, isn't it? That he just not quite in the right position to benefit. But it's very much softened by the fact that Joe got the points, because it meant that Sauber did score, which is a big deal for them. They scored in a way that is merited as well, as you and Mark said just now. So it'll be bittersweet for Bottas. It's bitter because it's another missed opportunity, but I think he'll still appreciate for Joe and for the people in his team that he knows have worked so hard this year actually have something to show for it.
And nice as well for Sauber on the weekend when the Qatar Investment Authority, it was announced they bought a minority stake in the team that's going to become Audi in 2026. I imagine we'll talk about that in a bit more depth in the future. A quick tip of the hat for Kevin Magnussen as well, finished 9th, had another strong weekend, and quite bad news for RB in the Constructors' Championship because struggled badly for race pace in the end. No points for them this weekend. Now 13 points behind Alpine and 8 points behind Haas with just Abu Dhabi to go. So barring a miracle, I think RB are probably condemned to 8th in the championship.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
So, you want to be a marketer. It's easy. You just have to score a ton of leads and figure out a way to turn them all into customers. Plus, manage a dozen channels, write a million blogs, and launch 100 campaigns all at once. When that's done, simply make your socials go viral and bring in record profits. No sweat. Okay, fine. It's a lot of sweat. But with HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools, launching benchmark-breaking campaigns is easier than ever. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Well, it wouldn't be the Race F1 podcast race review episode without us tackling your questions. If you're interested in joining the Race Members Club, you can click the link in the episode description or search for us on Patreon. You'll not only get question-asking privileges, but also exclusive bonus podcasts, ad-free listening, and much more. As ever, we'll get through some questions now, and we'll tackle more in our midweek podcast. A familiar theme for the first few questions. We'll all have one bite on this. Mark, Garen Moreno says, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Between the GPDA statements, sackings and strangeness all around the FIA, it feels like the leadership of Mohammed Ben Sulayem is failing. Can the FIA president be sacked?
He can't be sacked. He can be, it's like kind of prime minister be sacked. There's a voting process, and still got, I think, 2 years left on his current term. So, no, I think he can choose to stand down if he wants to, but it can't be forced upon him. And, there is a bit of disquiet between the FIA and F1, and F1 and the GPDA seem to be pretty much aligned. And the president seems to be becoming more isolated and more trenchant. And so it doesn't seem to be moving towards an amiable solution. So, we just have to wait and see how it goes from here. But it's not obvious how this is going to develop.
Scott, your question on this topic comes from Stephen Rucco. Were the penalties given out today to drivers a direct response from the FIA president as a backlash against the GPDA statements?
I don't think the penalties were, but I think there were other things around this weekend that were a backlash. There was an interview that Ben Sulayem did which was totally lacking in grace, where he basically told the drivers to shove it, mind their own business. He'll do whatever he wants at the FIA. He answers to no one except his members. So screw all of you with your scrutiny and accountability, because as long as he's making the people that vote for him happy, that's all he cares about. Utterly convinced that everything that's being done at the FIA is for the better and making improvements all round. So it's not about reasoning, but you almost can't engage with that kind of attitude and behaviour almost. And I think there were other elements this weekend of that interference with the FIA just sort of becoming clear. There was a drivers' meeting on Thursday which had been planned for a very long time. Some of the FIA commentary around that was very, this was brilliant and everything we're doing is brilliant and everyone's aligned and there's definitely no problems. And then 72 hours later, Ben Sulayem is telling the drivers that they don't need to tell them anything. And they don't care, none of their business, all of that. And then just some I would say oddities. The Verstappen grid penalty was unusual. The handling of the race, I think, was a direct consequence of what Ben Sulayem's been up to, because I don't think a more experienced race director handles it that way. And that's the thing is that is in no way pointing the finger or having a go at the race director. There are some people who have said, it was amateurish and whatever. But the point is that despite what a lot of people might believe, including the FIA president, a lot of us aren't actually interested in playing the blame game or pointing fingers. Like, the race director doesn't need to be hung out to dry. The safety car driver doesn't need to be criticised if the lights weren't turned off correctly. People make mistakes, systems fail, things go wrong, all of that. If everything's as great in the FIA garden as Ben Sulayem says it is, what's wrong with a little accountability? Just saying this wasn't quite as good as it could have been. These are the reasons why. This is what we'll try and do better next time. That's the kind of attitude you need and the messaging you need from the FIA. And unfortunately, Ben Sulayem is driving a very different message, and it is undermining the work of a lot of very good people at the FIA who just want things to be better.
Samarth, your question in this area comes from Tosin Olojo. Is this the point where all the firings by Ben Sulayem have truly touched F1? It seems as though having a single race director manage 3 races was overwhelming, and simple safety issues like the mirror on the track were ignored for several laps, but the entire weekend has felt like they've been making things up as they went along.
I think there's precedent for some of it. I think Lando Norris's penalty, for example, is actually, in my opinion, kind of hard to argue against in a way. I don't think it sounds that bad. But then when you look at something like a one-place grid penalty for Max Verstappen, you start to wonder where is that thought process? And I don't think that thought process comes from someone being strung out because they're doing 3 championships. If anything, I would think that because you're doing 3 championships, you'd probably have that precedent in your head, and you would kind of make more consistent decisions in a sense. Actually, in a way, I'm kind of all for having the same people kind of govern these things, so that when the drivers do come through the ranks, they kind of won't complain as much because they'll have all that consistency. In a way, I think that if a race director is looking at F2 and then going to F1, they're going to be more consistent, but we didn't see that this weekend. It was pretty weird. But I don't think it's an excuse to say just because the race director's been doing F3, F2, and F1 that they're strung out. I mean, I watched all of them. Actually, I was pretty tired after watching all of them, so fair enough. But no, genuinely, I don't think it's just that. I think it was a bit of a perfect storm in Qatar as well. I mean, we had, my theory is a bit of a weird one, is that the track layout just does not lend itself to cooperative racing. I think you've got a shorter DRS zone here, which makes people dive into the first sector. It makes things really messy. And when that happens, you're going to get a lot of clashes and stuff like that. So I think it was kind of a perfect storm of having lots of incidents. So I think, the FIA kind of shot themselves in the foot with that one a little bit by having the shorter DRS zone. They kind of created more incidents in that sense. You see a lot of people diving in for the inside and outside of turn 1, and then it gets messy into following corners, is what I'm trying to say. But then, some of those penalties really were harsh. Maybe sometimes they're just having a bad day and you make a decision. It shouldn't be like that, by the way. That is ridiculous. But that is the only thing I can think for it. I don't want to start a conspiracy that I think they're trying to get back at drivers and stuff, though.
And the final question in this subject area that I'll take comes from Jeremy Husted. Given the multiple inconsistent stewarding decisions throughout the weekend, could this be the final straw in finally appointing permanent stewards? Well, I wouldn't say it's the final straw, but without getting caught up in the decisions themselves, I think there has for a long time been a strong case for having permanent stewards. They are the referees. Big-time international sports have long since pretty much universally gone to professional referees. That's what the stewards are. And I think a permanent panel would make an enormous amount of sense. Now, they're not as random perhaps wasn't the word, but it's still a relatively consistent pool at the moment in terms of the fact there's a few chairs of them and then they rotate around. But you see quite a few of the same names popping up. So that's good. And there's good people, they take it seriously. And for all of the conspiracy theories about everyone's agendas, etc., 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 you won't find anyone in motorsport who you can't come up with some tenuous connection to something that you can then say is the reason for decisions. But I do think there's a strong argument for permanent stewards, professional paid stewards. The GPDA has made this argument as well. George Russell's articulated a lot recently. I don't think this was the final straw, but I just think that there should be a groundswell of support towards this. The big question is who should pay for it, because everyone will say the FIA should, and the FIA will probably say, well, F1 needs to give us more money so that we can do it. So that's the underlying political battle. Let's move out of that realm now for some other questions. Mark, Ollie Emerson asks, is there anything particular about the Qatar track that led to such a chaotic race?
Only in the sense that the circumstances of the mirror falling on in the middle of the track happened at just the time that everyone's tyres were wearing out, as we touched on before. So that sort of maximised the chaos that if that had happened earlier in the race, 10, 15 laps, you wouldn't have seen the ensuing chaos, I suspect. So only that. I don't think there's anything particularly about the layout that invites incident. It's very, very high speed, and the drivers love it. And Oscar Piastri even saying it's his absolute favourite track, and he gets more of a kick out of driving a car around there than any other track he's been on.
Next question for you, Scott, is a combination from Rick Harderpick, Miles Mason, Mark Martin, Alex Hindley and Simon Ems. They all asked about Verstappen's one-place grid penalty. So the all-encompassing question is, why was Verstappen penalised given 17 drivers were investigated? What exactly was he penalised for? Do the rules really allow a one-place grid penalty? How far outside the delta time was Verstappen? And finally, do the stewards have a communications problem, given the penalty annoyed a lot of people? So lots of ground to cover there, but hopefully breaks down nice and easily.
Yeah, so he was penalised. I understand a point about 17 drivers were investigated. So there are almost always drivers summoned for not following the delta time. It's a reference time to make sure that cars aren't going around too slowly. Usually these get investigated and they are cleared because there are very obvious reasons, legitimate reasons why the delta time couldn't be followed effectively. And it usually comes down to like an extreme amount of backing up or having to get out of the way of multiple cars or whatever. The simplest way to explain why Verstappen got punished is because he was eventually deemed guilty of driving unnecessarily slowly because he was very, very slow, but he was also, in the steward's view, effectively dawdling on the racing line. And even though George Russell wasn't on a push lap, there was another car approaching at what the stewards clearly felt was the legitimate speed. And even though there wasn't a collision or anything like that, it's impeding without impeding a flying lap effectively. So there's also an implication that what Verstappen did conferred an advantage because either Russell was affected in terms of starting his next lap and potentially getting a little bit damaged by running slightly wide over the curb in avoidance and blah, 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 but also presumably trying to clamp down on any tactics that involve a driver going so slowly that their tyres are super cool and therefore they get an advantage that way. But Verstappen wasn't trying to do any of that. I sincerely believe he was genuinely just trying to keep out of the way. And it was very strange because Russell had full sight of him. I don't really think it needed to be as much of a near miss as it was made out to be. So in terms of allowing a one-place grid penalty, yeah, the rules do allow that because the stewards have discretion. And it's actually an example of what I think we touched on a little bit earlier about the penalty that Lando got during the race. Some things are effectively prescribed for the stewards. They have like a menu of punishments to choose from, and some are a little bit more, if it's this, you should apply this. It's a lot more simple. With what Verstappen did is an example of where they can apply discretion. So they take the view that it's normally a 3-place grid penalty for impeding, but it wasn't technically impeding because Russell wasn't on a push lap. So it's a different offence and therefore a different punishment. One place penalty felt correct in their mind. In a way, it might have even been corrective. If they felt that combination of circumstances was the reason Verstappen got pole and not Russell, they effectively flipped the results. But that leads into the final part of the question, which is kind of the communications problem, because I don't know exactly how far outside the delta time Verstappen was. I don't have that to hand at the moment, and it almost sometimes it doesn't matter. It's not about there's a percentage threshold or whatever. It's at the steward's discretion.
I think it was 18 seconds.
18 seconds. Okay, yeah. So miles outside, and even if there was an arbitrary cutoff track by track, I would imagine 18 seconds is well beyond it. But on the communications thing, what I've tried to explain there includes a couple of inferences from what the stewards have said. If it is as simple as what Verstappen did effectively gained him an advantage and hurt Russell, just say that. So many times there are long justifications or sometimes no justifications at all in stewards' documents. They are bafflingly inconsistent in the detail that they include and what they choose to omit. And yeah, I just think, again, to come back to a point I made previously about accountability and transparency and all of that, better stewards' communications would go a long way to help in that. And again, I think that is something that some people want, because I know a few of the stewards. I speak to a few of the stewards, and I know that a lot of them are very switched on, committed people who want people to better understand what it is they're doing.
Yeah, makes perfect sense to explain, because knowledge means people will understand it. I mean, still, some people won't listen or won't read it or whatever, but yeah, the more information, the better. Samarth, a question from Stranded Colourwork. There seemed to be some palpable tension at Aston Martin during the race. How much of Alonso's spicy broadcasted message was him playing the game, being himself, and how much of it was a sign of more serious frustration?
Yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, it's not the first time Fernando Alonso has expressed his dissatisfaction with a car over the radio. This was very pointed, and look, he wants a more efficient car going into next year. He's not happy, and I think they got the message. But as I said earlier in the podcast, I don't think they're on it. I just don't think Aston Martin are there. So yeah, definitely tension. He was losing traction. I think it was coming out of final corner as well, but yeah, he was kind of losing. There were like a set of 4 laps in his first stint, I think, where he just lost so much time. And then after that, he kind of put it back on. He was actually fine down the straight. So it was just him kind of losing speed out the final corner and then losing pace. But what he's saying is true. In those corners, they're really suffering. Yeah, so a little bit of tension there. And I think that does build up when you supply a bad car to Fernando Alonso for a number of races on end. I don't know what the threshold is for him, but yeah, it certainly builds up. And I think he's getting there now where he's really struggling. That said, again, 7th today. Fantastic result. It's just I think he can see through that and say this car is not a 7th place car.
Next question I'll take from Gordon Ross. The BBC coverage of the sprint race seemed flabbergasted that Norris handed the win to Piastri, while other journalists are equally bemused. Is this an indication that nobody expects F1 drivers to show sportsmanship anymore? I must admit, I wasn't flabbergasted. I wasn't that bothered either way, really. I thought it was quite clever from Norris to hand Oscar Piastri a bucket of nothing. To pay him back for the Interlagos point he was giving him, because it was something clearly Norris wanted to do because he felt he should do, because it was sporting after he was given the Interlagos sprint. But nobody cares about sprint races. The drivers certainly don't. So it's not giving away anything. So it evens up the score for nothing. I saw a few people didn't like it, but I don't know what anyone else made of it. Anyone else have any concerns about it? Any bemusement evidence? Anybody dislike it?
I don't like stuff like that. Why not? It almost...
What sort of stuff is it specifically you don't like?
People doing nice things for other people really grinds his gears.
Great use of the word stuff there, isn't it? Yeah, I feel like it kind of devalues it.
Down with stuff.
I've been driving you around all weekend. This is the thanks I get. Unbelievable, honestly. All right, Scott, go on then. What's your take on it?
We haven't heard your take yet. You just said you didn't like stuff.
I didn't like it. I thought it devalued it.
Well, of course it did. It wasn't about that. But I think this is a perfect opportunity. I think we have the chance to adjudicate here and set this as the agreement for everyone going forward, fans, media, teams, FIA, Formula One alike. We all agree from here on out, Oscar Piastri won the Brazilian Grand Prix sprint race, Lando Norris won the Qatar Grand Prix sprint race. We don't need to deal with the nuance, the caveats of, well, you know, Piastri let Norris by in Brazil, so that's why No, let's just, they've got one each now, so Norris can have Brazil, because Piastri can have Brazil, because that's where he was going to win, and Norris can have Qatar, because that's where he was going to win. And then that's it. We don't have to worry about it going forward. As for what happened here, I actually didn't mind it purely because it wasn't choreographed and it was Norris doing it at the last minute of his own volition, which turned it from, oh, this is a really annoying, cringy thing that didn't need to be done, to, that's definitely stressed McLaren out massively and it's caught me by surprise and I quite like it.
Well, they told him at least 3 times in the closing stages not to do it, so that was quite amusing. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't particularly bothered with it, and
I just enjoy the niche element of a driver defying team orders to do something for their teammate. When does that doesn't happen?
But it's a little bit of credit in the bank. I always think it's a great idea to be generous to your teammate when it doesn't really matter, because then when it does matter, then they might have to be generous back to you. You know, you don't need to have to, choose your battles. I thought that was a very clever move from Norris, and I do think there was some sportsmanship. He felt like he should pay Oscar Piastri back for Interlagos, but nobody's that bothered about the sprints, unfortunately. Mark, question for you from Michael Searle. A question on behalf of George Russell. Why did they put the expletive deleted hards back on? It feels like an absolutely wild decision considering the circumstances.
The only set of mediums he had got 6 laps on them already, as one thing. And the other thing is that he just worn out his front mediums much sooner than they were expecting pre-race. So in order to avoid a 2-stop, which would definitely have been a disastrous strategy, they decided not to risk that, so put the hards on. And actually, when you look at his pace and fuel correct it, his pace in the first stint, his subsequent pace on the hards was about the same.
Scott, question from Sebastian Stolzer. Why was Verstappen clearly pushing off Norris in turn 1 at the second restart not even under consideration for an investigation?
Because I think he was fully alongside, wheel-to-wheel battle. There was still room for Norris on the outside. It was incredibly robust. It was a classic case of Verstappen's I am not being overtaken around the outside philosophy in effect. And it was borderline at worst, but it certainly wasn't any worse than that. It's the kind of move that I think you get away with making maybe once in a Grand Prix. Pick your moment to deploy it. It's effectively your kind of joker. But I don't think it was. I think it would have been very harsh to have investigated it, let alone penalise it.
Samarth, your final question from Alex AG. Is this kind of circuit with this generation of car doomed to be a processional race? Even the Formula 2 race yesterday seemed stagnant until the TAR strategy kicked in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously Formula 1 and Formula 2 are in slightly different camps in that Formula 2 is just not as powerful. So you kind of need that longer DRS zone, and then there's not really another place they can put it around the circuit. I don't think with long flowing corners that are more suited to motorcycle racing, it's not conducive to F1. I mean, I think, or even F2 as you asked, I think you need some more hard braking zones and maybe like one more straight around here. And in my head, it's now turned into a jumble of corners that I can't even fathom. I don't think it's. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's suited. That's not to say it's a bad lap. I think drivers must really enjoy these long flowing corners. It must be a really fun qualifying lap. But then, once you get to the race, it is just so processional. And then, as I said before, them reducing the DRS zone, I think it actually caused chaos today. The F2 drivers in particular complained about just how hard it was to overtake, because you essentially have to dive into into the inside or the outside of turn 1 and going side by side through the rest of the corners, you're just going to cook your tyres. You don't want to get off the racing line. There's going to be too much slip. We saw it in the F2 sprint race, actually. The medium tyres were dropping off so quickly. It was really kind of painful for them in a sense. Now, can they have different DRS zones for different championships, maybe, is one thing that was brought up? Well, no, basically. The FIA can't just move that around because the infrastructure is so complicated. So you can't at least improve F2. So I don't know. I suspect for next year it's going to be improved again. Maybe there's a good compromise here. Maybe they can move it 50 meters this time and it will just be right. That'll be the correct amount.
This isn't a perfect comparison, and it might be a take that annoys a few people that really like the track I'm about to compare it to, but it feels a little bit Mugello of the Middle East, this circuit for F1 cars. It's not quite the same. It needs a longer straight, and obviously Mugello's got a tremendous amount of character, but just that kind of brilliant qualifying spectacle track that drivers love to drive on, but doesn't necessarily lend itself to a great race track for F1 cars. It just reminds me of that brilliant anomaly of Mugello just appearing on the F1 calendar during the COVID season.
And the final question from Eddar Gaming that I will take is, when Qatar joined the calendar, it was said that the current track would be short-term until one could be built downtown. I haven't heard much said about it since, so I wondered if that was still the plan and what's the progress, or if F1 had found its home at this circuit. Yes, F1 has found its home at this circuit. You're quite right. That was said when it originally came in. If you remember, it came in for 2021. It was a relatively late edition. They were still scrambling around to make the calendar work because that was still the sort of second COVID year. They basically felt that the circuit wasn't quite up to it in terms of all the facilities. So the choice was, well, either you need to massively improve the circuit and the facilities in future, or you need a new build track elsewhere. And they ended up, obviously, there wasn't a race in 22 because of the World Cup. And then the sort of first proper Qatar Grand Prix almost was in 2023, but they did invest in the circuit and the facilities, and they got it much more up to the standard they want. So that original condition about a new circuit was all to do with we'll let you have the race in 21 because we need it, but we are not going to establish a sort of a precedent that the track and the facilities are fine. So yeah, the organisers went with beefing up the Lusail facility. So yeah, Qatar is now set for the foreseeable. Well, thanks to Scott, Samarth and Mark for your insight. Thanks to all of you for your questions. I'm sure we'll get to more of them in the midweek podcast episode. We'll be heading to the UAE any minute now, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix.
The Athletic.